Firstly, I'd like to say thanks to Ross and John and Dee and my colleague Donna as well for putting these series of seminars together, because I think they're a really useful package of resources and help for people in politics and international studies across the sector, which is really terrific. With the two organisations kind of combining their resources on this as well. I have, talking about module design, this does necessarily cover and touch on a whole series of areas that are in other webinars and to some extent in the first webinar I did a few weeks ago, and I'm hoping I don't repeat things too much, but apologies if there is some repetition in there. And I've also, having gone back through the slides, it is a little bit death by PowerPoint slide, so I apologise a bit for that. But I also realise I've approached this at quite an abstract level, and had intended to bring in more kind of concrete examples from some of the work we did, but perhaps in the discussion, one of the things we could do in the discussion time, I'm hoping I can get through this in about 30 minutes. One of the things in the discussion time we have perhaps would be to share some examples of things that have worked and approaches to module design that have worked. Moving on, I've divided this into broadly three sections, and these aren't in a sense chronological sections, in that each of them can be done at different stages of the module design and writing process. So it's not a kind of a linear progression in that sense, but hopefully it gives us sort of three approaches or ways of looking at the module design process that you can pull hopefully some useful material from. I'm also aware that there may be people here at very different stages in terms of experience and so on. So some of this might seem fairly basic, and some of it may seem slightly less so. Hopefully, it's not all too obvious to you, and there's something at least of interest. Anyway, let's go on. So the three sections. The first is thinking about things to do with the sort of higher level planning of the module, to do with the overall design of what this piece of curriculum is and where it fits. The second is thinking about different dimensions of trying to enhance the learning experience for students and ways we can improve that. And thirdly, and more briefly at the end, I'll just indicate some ideas about how you can think about both mapping and reviewing or auditing your module from a number of different angles that may be useful at different stages of the process. So to begin with the kind of high level planning, and this I think will be familiar to pretty much everyone, certainly everyone working in UKHE, in terms of situating any particular module, it comes as part of, in a sense, a chain from QAA and other external benchmarks and requirements about qualifications, and particularly the QA benchmark statement for politics and international studies in our case, within and in relation to which our qualifications, whether they're straight politics or politics and IR or one of the subfields within those, sit. And then the kind of learning that we expect of students differs for that qualification depending on which level the students are at, whether it's level 1 first year or second year or third year for undergraduate, or whatever stage of masters if we're talking about masters modules. And then the module and its learning outcomes and aims and educational purpose is kind of constructed in relation to where it sits within that. And I think some things to think about, one is that the very different roles that compulsory modules serve versus optional ones. Compulsory modules are the ones all students take, so they have to deliver whatever the learning outcomes are of the qualification. Optional modules can serve a slightly more varied role within any given qualification, and that differs to some extent depending on what the structure of qualifications are, and there's a variety out there. Some very linear and vertical in terms of the progression expected of students. Others sometimes referred to as either satellite or jigsaw patterns, or sometimes a mosaic pattern, where different components of teaching in the end lock together to produce the aim, deliver the educational aims that the qualification sets. Or pyramids and spirals, or otherwise people have talked about the construction and the structure of qualifications, and depending on that, your module might serve different purposes within that. In terms of thinking about the module as well, it's worth thinking about what kinds of outcomes you and your students want from the module. And I think we're all in areas of teaching where we're beyond simply wanting kind of declarative outcomes from students, that we tell them stuff and then they tell it back to us. Although there are elements of that in many examples of learning outcomes, particularly relating to knowledge and understanding and what we expect students to know about the discipline, about the relevant empirical matter that the disciplines speak to. But nearly, even in those senses, we're also wanting students to do things with knowledge, to develop and use cognitive skills, and particularly, I think, in terms of some important areas that are more prominent now and possibly increasing in prominence around skills and employability and practical and professional skills that we might also build in to our learning. So it's worth thinking about what are the kinds of outcomes we're wanting from students, not least because what the aims we have for our modules are, what those aims are, helps to drive decisions about what kinds of learning experience we give to students, what kinds of material we develop. Now, one way of thinking about that, it's not the only way, but so, and I know quite a lot of people find it quite helpful to think about it, comes from Biggs's idea about constructive alignment, which he summarized as the key is that the components in the teaching system, especially the teaching methods used and the assessment tasks, are aligned to the learning activities assumed in the intended outcomes. That is, there's an alignment between what we want students to achieve from our module and the things we ask them to do and the ways in which we assess those. But also I think it's worth thinking how those things are built cumulatively, both within a qualification but also within a module itself, and particularly the case in larger credit modules, where we need to provide opportunities for students for consolidation as well as further development of knowledge, and provide opportunities for self or external assessment, whether that's formative assessments that can get feedback from us as teachers, or opportunities for their own self-reflection. And people sometimes refer to this kind of cumulative building in terms of a spiral or ladder. The diagram is the best I could do. I couldn't figure out a way of representing a spiral graphically, I'm afraid, but that's the best. But thinking about where ideas are taught, practiced, further developed, learning deepened, and then assessed as you progress through any particular module. And not forgetting, of course, the role of assessment in this. And I won't talk about assessment much because it was covered so well in the webinar that the Simons, Lightfoot and Rofe and Helen Williams gave recently, which is available if you didn't catch that. But thinking about creative forms of assessment, what role they play, and how they link to, how they help students to show us that they have attained outcomes, but also how assessment can be a productive and a creative process in itself, that it helps to realize the kinds of learning that we hope students are able to develop from our module. Moving on from that, in terms of planning, the kind of, and this I think is especially important in when you're teaching at a distance. I mentioned this and talked about this a bit at the previous webinar, so I don't want to labour the point too much. but the approach to scaffolding drawn from particularly Salmon's work, but there's some useful publications from Rofe and Lee as well, and the BISA PSA webinar that Lesson Bandera did about scaffolding and skills progression is also an important thing to think about when putting the building blocks of a module together. That learning paths need to be gradual, with markers for checking on feedback, on understanding and assessment built into the material. That we provide self-check or self-audit exercises for students, and also, as I mentioned before, formative assessments, computer marked assessments or quizzes and polls can be used to help ensure that understanding. And it's partly because you don't have if you don't have a student in front of you, or you have them in front of you much less than you're used to, it's very easy to lose students by making leaps that are too great, that they don't have the building blocks with which to understand the more complex or more developed theoretical or conceptual ideas that we might be developing through a module. And I think it's also important in the current context for students that have experienced more or less only face-to-face or mostly face-to-face, or that's been the core component of their teaching, their learning experience with us, where they're switching to a more online mode. Many will need some support in terms of relating to the functionality of virtual learning environments. A lot of their learning will be less synchronous than they used to, and that creates demands in terms of time management and prioritization of tasks and so forth, and they will need help with that as well. And in terms of the overall trajectory of a module, I think it's also good if we can give students a sense of direction of the kind of journey of as a whole through the module, whatever kind of image or metaphor you find useful for that, whether it's ladders or arcs or spirals, giving students some sense of how the whole fits together and where their beginning and end points are is also a useful kind of assistance to many students. In terms of the substantive content and structuring and chunking of material, I think this goes for whether you're constructing an online module or a blended module that combines online and face-to-face together, or if you're converting an existing face-to-face module to include a much greater degree of online material. Thinking carefully about how you break down that whole package of learning into much more heavily structured and ordered pieces of work. If it's a fairly large module, say 20 credit module, you may want to think about dividing it into parts or blocks. But whether you do that or not, you certainly need to think about how you would divide up the work into specific weeks of study and what package of materials you provide for each week for the students to do. And there it may look somewhat different to your current sequence of teaching. In many cases, with a kind of lecture and seminar format, the seminar follows the week after the lecture. With an online package of materials, that starts getting very confusing if the kinds of tasks that you would normally do in a seminar come the week following the kinds of learning that you would have delivered through a lecture. It's probably much more necessary to bring those two things together in a single week's worth of package. But the weeks then themselves can be broken down into separate tasks, and those tasks into separate sections. And it's important to think about how that's structured. It's important, once you've started to work on that, that when presenting the material to students, you're signaling or communicating clear pathways through those weeks, tasks and sections, that you're not just giving them a kind of amorphous bunch of stuff to work through in their own way, though a kind of structured approach on those lines sometimes can work. But we need to be communicating clearly. If we don't have students in front of us saying, I don't understand what I'm doing this week, we need to be able to communicate clearly to students what we're expecting in each of those in each of those stages. Another thing I think that's, I mentioned this in the previous one, so I won't dwell on it too much, but avoid overly lengthy tasks, especially online. Pages of text that students have to scroll down endlessly are extremely difficult for students to concentrate on over long periods of time. So breaking those down. Lectures, we know from face-to-face lectures that students' attention waxes and wanes through the lecture. So think about, if you're converting your lectures to online, think about separating those out into, say, 3, possibly 4 chunks, and maybe think about pause and reflect activities at the end of each one, so that they're separated out into more distinct chunks of work that will hopefully hold the students' engagement longer. But in putting all this together, another key lesson, I think, is to avoid too much media hopping. That is, avoid asking students to, say, read first part of a textbook chapter, then come back online, then watch something else, then come back online, then go back to the textbook. As far as possible, try to keep the switching between media. Each time there's a switch, it adds to the student workload. There's an added transaction cost at each point. So it's quite important, where possible, to keep, in terms of your use of media, keep that hopping between media to a minimum. I'll just take a drink. Okay, if that's the kind of some of the things I think that help to shape the high level structure of the module, and then how you break down the content into a pathway composed of a series of tasks for students. I think the second process to think about is to look at how we can approach that material and look at ways we can enhance the learning experience for students that make it more engaging and more rewarding and more effective as a process for students. The first aspect to this, and in some ways it's a very basic one, is to think about how you shape the module to design it for retention, to keep students on the module, to minimize dropouts, to make it a doable, achievable experience for students. It matters, retention matters for students, because failure or dropping out is a tremendously negative thing in many cases. There are drivers of student dropping out that are completely beyond our control, things in personal, private lives or work lives that we can't really influence. But at least we can think about trying to design the material in the best way possible to make it achievable and doable for students. It matters for finances, whether you're talking about your university's finances, because dropout is extremely expensive, it costs a lot of income, but it's also important for students as well. It's increasingly a focus of external QA processes. And I think it's also a really important aspect of equity concerns. In distance learning, online learning, there are multiplier effects on students from low socioeconomic backgrounds or with declared disabilities and so forth. And we need to do as much as we can to address those as well. One of the approaches or one of the kind of models developed at the OU, and this was the outcome of a project that looked at a whole series of internal Open University pilots and research projects and so on into retention, but also that drew on some of the external pedagogic research as well, developed by Martin Weller and colleagues, that they summarized as the Iceberg model. And it gives a whole series of prompts. It was published externally as well as within the OU, I think. And they're a series of kind of injunctions or suggestions for how we improve modules, is to make sure that we're giving students an an integrated package that fits together and makes sense to students, that we do what we can to make students feel like they belong to a learning community, both with other students and also in relation to the academic staff. That the material we produce is engaging, that the material, the learning is balanced, that is, we're not designing in big peaks and troughs in terms of student workload week by week, and I'll come back to that a bit towards the end. That the material we provide is economical, not economical in the sense of focusing very carefully on how it helps to students to realize the educational outcomes, the learning outcomes that we have set for the module, that we're not overwhelming them with huge amounts of material that is kind of overkill in terms of what they need to achieve success in the module, and also that provides points for student reflection on their own progress, and that gives learning trajectories that are gradual and that don't have big jumps or big conceptual leaps, points at which we would lose students. So there are other ways of thinking about that, but that's, you know, one. I think it touches on a lot of the things that help us to think about how to design modules with an eye on retention. Within that, I think also a key series of choices that we all need to make in either putting together modules that are solely online or ones that are a mix of online and face-to-face, is around choosing modes of delivery and on media. So for the online components of a blended module, or for modules that are entirely online, I think it's a good idea as far as possible to think beyond simply trying to replicate lecture and seminar. It may be, in the current circumstances, in the time you have available and the resources that your university is giving you, that creating an online version of a lecture plus seminar format is the best and is good enough in the circumstances. But I think to the extent that you have more time with which to work on this and more resources provided by your institution to help you in this, then it's worth thinking beyond that for moving online, to try and break apart that pattern in a way that makes sense for distance learning. In choosing media, it's very important to think about the particular complexity of the material that you're giving. Highly complex conceptual and theoretical material is quite difficult to convey online. It may be where short lecture segments have a role, but it might also be a place where print or printable material is available. We all do this anywhere in our research lives, deal with complex ideas in a written printable form, rather than trying to read very dense text on a screen, which often loses students or proves or slows them down, or both of which can have a significant effect on their progress. And also think about the place of AV within the overall kind of package of things that you develop within a module. It plays a key role in enhancing material and helping engage students. It can liven up material. One of the things we did successfully on an IR module was to use videos of IR theorists, which for some students was a better way in to understanding those theoretical approaches than simply reading a kind of a textbook chapter or a journal article. It's also other good uses of AV is to represent lived experiences of people in different social circumstances, and to help deliver a variety of diversity of voice within our modules as well. And I think it's also worth, as far as you can, think about providing alternative formats. That's alternative formats for any student, because different students react differently to, some prefer more visual modes of learning and others more more text-based, but also alternative formats for students who may have declared disabilities and learning needs that need to be catered for. So that needs to be thought about as well in terms of choice of media and how it's delivered. I think the other thing that, and this is me sort of trying to think in the circumstances that that many of you may be at face-to-face universities. If you're in a situation where you're being asked to reduce, possibly quite radically reduce, the amount of time spent face-to-face with students, I think it then increases the need to prioritize what you use that face-to-face time for, and think about what it is that face-to-face can deliver that is difficult to deliver online. And similarly, you can think the other way around. What could you do online? You know, there may be sections of what you would normally deliver in lectures. Actually, it would be better use of that time for discussion, group work, the kind of interaction you might get through a seminar, rather than the kind of delivery of information that sometimes forms parts of lectures, which arguably could be done via other means. So I think if you're faced with that kind of choice, then that kind of process of prioritizing a scarce resource of face-to-face time in the next few months may be an issue we could also talk about. Another aspect of the learning experience is it's a real challenge, collaboration in learning communities. And as far as possible, we should think of both formal and informal spaces for student interaction, whether that's forum-based or online seminars. Within some of those, I think it's, if students are much less in contact in a face-to-face sense, then having an online presence from either the module leader or the module team or the academics, that is also something we find is valued by students. In terms of the work done in seminars, I won't talk about this because my colleague Andy O'Kane's doing one of the webinars later in August about moving seminars and effectively into online environments. So I'll leave that. He knows far more about it than I do. Anyway, but also think about things like collaborative tasks that students can do as part of the learning at a distance. One of the exercises that works quite well on one of our modules is getting students collaboratively to pull together an annotated bibliography of sources. And also things like peer review. Helen talked about this in one of the earlier webinars, where it's, and it has to be constructed quite carefully, but where it's supportive, qualitative, then peer review or peer assessment can also play a role in building that community. And finally, before moving on to the next section, two kind of broader injunctions. Firstly, keep it lively. Think about ways of presenting and getting students into the material that is engaging, that engages their interest from the off, and that helps to drive their engagement and their commitment to the learning paths that we're setting out for them. Think about controversy-based teaching or problem-solving or dilemma-led teaching as some examples of doing that. And keep it simple. Focus on developing material that is needed for students to help realizing the teaching aims or the learning outcomes of the module. And alongside that, build the independent skills rather than trying to make a kind of encyclopedic provision of all the information you know in relation to a topic, which, if it's not organized and prioritized for students, can become overwhelming, both in terms of workload and in terms of their ability to focus on what matters. Lastly, and I'll be finished fairly soon, which is just as well, I think, a number of, and this is much briefer and fewer, so there's only 2 more slides you'd be glad to hear. A number of ideas about how you can map your modules from different angles, and there are various kind of tools you could developed for doing this, but it's worth thinking about these processes both as you're in advance, as you're planning your module, during the process by which you're putting it together, either the process of converting your existing module into a blended or an online only a delivery, or if you're writing a new module from scratch, it can be used during that process to check on where you are. And it can also be used as a review or an audit process once the module's in existence or once students are studying it. So again, as with several of these other things, it's not something that comes necessarily at a particular point in the design process, but can be used in different ways at different points in that process. I'll finish with this slide. Some ideas of things that you might want to map for the module as a whole. The first of which relates back to that point about retention and having a balanced workload that doesn't overload students and doesn't give them very high peaks and troughs of work to do. For that, you need a basic idea of how much you're expecting from students. You need to try to spread that out as far as possible in an even way across the module. And you need some kind of rubric for how much study time you expect students to do for different activities. And that will vary depending on the complexity of the material. It will vary depending on the media you're using, reading speeds as compared to how much time you would give students for video or audio material. So there's a whole set of things that you need to have an idea of in order to then go through the weeks or the blocks that you've structured your module into, to check that you're not building in very difficult workload burdens for students at different times. Another way of looking through some of the package, the blend of materials, the blend of online and face-to-face, or the different types of activity you ask students to do as part of the module, is to think about the kinds of learning experience each of those is presenting to students and getting students to engage with. And there's a whole list. This isn't the whole list, but the activities that are stimulative or finding material, productive activities where you get students to actually do something and produce some kind of artifact of some kind, reflective points of reflection on learning, and so on. There's a whole set more, and that again can be a useful way of thinking about what mix of learning experience the module is giving to students. There's no kind of hard and fast rule about what's the correct one. It will vary depending on what you're hoping students will get from the module and the kinds of material you're including in it. There's a whole set of reviews and audits that may be happening anyway in your QA processes, but are all useful and valuable things to do anyway, which auditing the module materials for accessibility, auditing your module content in terms of equality and diversity, providing a variety of avenues for student feedback. Some of it might be just ad hoc forum-based feedback. You don't have, or you might, if you've moved completely online, you wouldn't have students there at the end of a seminar and lecture who can chat to and say that they think it's great or otherwise. So providing some means for that kind of informal feedback, as well as the more usual surveys. But if you're moving online or moving large chunks of your teaching online, it might also be necessary to think about the existing student end of module surveys that you have and how they need to be changed to take account of how students have coped with the online aspects of teaching. And you might also build in processes by which students can then influence the content either while the module is in flight, through keeping areas of the module empty that students can then, with you, help to fill those, or as more normally happens, I think student feedback then generates changes in future delivery of the module for the following cohorts. And finally, back to where we began in some ways with the learning outcomes, the teaching educational aims of the module, thinking about where each of those are taught, practiced, developed, and assessed through the module. And that might be, very likely will be more than one place, but another kind of mapping exercise that you can do in reviewing where you got to. And I think in all of this, just two concluding thoughts. One is that this kind of ongoing review of our teaching is itself a good reflective process for us to engage in any case. And something that I mentioned in the previous webinar, it's also a kind of process that it's very good to involve your colleagues in, so that there is a dialogue among a teaching team or on how you're addressing these various aspects in your teaching. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I've put in these will be circulated, I guess. They'll put in some references to some of the pieces that I mentioned, and I thought in the discussion, I mean, obviously if the kind of general questions or comments, absolutely fine, whatever people want to talk about. But if there are examples of good design that people felt like sharing, or approaches to the overall process of module design that have worked for you, I think that would be good to hear as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand back over to Ross, I think.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, William. That was really, really useful, especially as I'm, currently in the process of redesigning my modules for the upcoming year. And there's lots of things that have made me think twice about some of the things that I've started doing that I might need to change.
To create extra work for you.
Yeah, I should have done it right the first time. It's my own fault, but it's been really useful. There were some questions in the chat, and I'll just kind of go through them as they've come up. But if people want to kind of speak up and share ideas, just put that in the chat and I can hand the mic over to people. But the first question has come through, and I completely thought this myself actually, regarding media hopping. Could you elaborate a little bit more, please? I'd like to exploit the online environment to get them to look at videos, put them into relevant news articles. Are you just saying I should not have them switch between activities to list other medias at the end, or are you advising it to keep it to a minimum overall?
No, I suppose the thing that we have in mind when we try to minimize media hopping is about the environment, is not switching between, not say getting a student to read, say, go and read the first half of this chapter, that if you have a module textbook, say, where they go off, do that, then come back online, do another couple of short tasks, then send them off to somewhere else, then come back online. At each time you're moving students away and then back, there's a chance that they lose the thread, or it feels like it adds to the kind of burden on students. So it's minimizing in that sense. Obviously, if you have a long period of work, or a long section of work that's all online, you can embed within that a whole series of different kinds of media, whether it's AV or text or interactive activities and so on. And that is much less burdensome for students. That kind of switching, because we're all used so used to kind of the multimedia provision within an online environment. So it's not that, it's more that kind of thing. Obviously, if you're sending students out to do some work in the library and then come back, that would be that might be something else you'd want to set aside a longer period of time for before switching back and forth, rather than coming to and fro a great deal. So it's more that kind of being present in the online environment, then going somewhere else, then coming back, and going somewhere else, that is found to be problematic for students. Is that?
Yeah, that really helps me. I think,
okay.
One of my things is I've kind of tried to compensate with the lack of face-to-face by giving them so much extra stuff. And I've kind of think I've over-egged my pudding. So that is very useful. Another really useful question, and I think something we're all facing, departments as a whole, is building a learning community is a big challenge, especially online. And I think there's a problem around both in the classroom and with a cohort. Do you have any practical suggestions around this?
We had this question last time around as well, and I think it is just a genuinely difficult thing to do. I don't think it's something that we have completely cracked. The kinds of things that we try includes sort of required forum-based work, work through some kind of online seminar system. We happen to use Adobe Connect, but there's Blackboard and all sorts of things. Trying to get students to participate in that, building familiarity. If you have a new cohort coming in, building familiarity among that cohort is obviously quite important. The kind of the way students get to know each other in a normal university environment through just turning up to the same events and chatting around that, it is a difficult thing to replicate. But I think this is what I meant by thinking about formal and informal spaces. So setting up rooms that aren't really dedicated to specific teaching tasks, or setting up forum places or cafes or chat rooms or whatever it is, but also allow some of that kind of idle chat among students, or where they can interact on things other than the module. I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is in relation to the academic staff, who they won't, if it's fully online, they won't have the familiarity with, they won't get to know as well as they do in face-to-face universities. So it's ways of making yourselves as module leaders or module team members available, and interacting with students in a variety of settings. I think some aspects of this will be covered by in that later webinar as well on online seminars, because that's obviously also a key. The challenges of getting students to engage online is often quite a significant one. In terms of, if, say, you're delivering a piece of teaching about introducing a IR theory, say, that might be the task. In this section, in this task, this part of the week's work, you're going to get introduced to constructivism or whatever. Then that would then need to be broken down physically in terms of the screens or the web pages or whatever it is that students then look at, needs to be broken down into a number of different sections. That we find that if you have long streams of text, that can be very off-putting for students who end up never getting to the end and just skipping on to the next screen. Or you might be, it might be introducing a particular, you might say the task is introducing a particular topic area, and that might be then composed of a number of different types of media, some text, some interactive, some AV, and those could be the kind of core point of the sections within that task. I suppose that's what I have in mind.
Yeah, that's very useful. Thank you very much. I'm just going to work my way through these questions as logically as I can. There's a lot of questions around learning community, but I think what Will said was really, really useful. I expect a lot of us will be doing a lot of online classes and face-to-face for a minority of students who want to attend. Do you have any suggestions on how to balance that? And how you think about these activities and use these as opportunities?
for kind of online seminars, is that?
Yeah, enrichment activities.
I'm tempted to bat that over to Andy O'Kane, who's doing work on it, how to engage students in online seminars, because there are a variety of kind of techniques for doing that, depending on what sort of tools you're using. It is the case that getting students to, I mean, it's often the case in face-to-face seminars, you have some students who hate participating and you have to devise ways of doing that. And a lot of those can then be replicated online, so you can depending on which tools you have available, you can break them down into separate rooms where they're set off on a group task in a smaller group, and then come back to a kind of plenary session, that sort of activity. We're building in requirements on students that whether they have to present to a seminar or collaboratively put together a presentation, that can be done online as well as it can be done online in a different way to how you do it face to face, but those sort of techniques are translatable as well. So I suppose it's kind of thinking creatively around how online alternatives can help to deliver some of the same experience of a sort of seminar discussion.
I think there's a really difficult, really important question here, and it's one of those kind of, how do you marry up aspects of teaching together through module design, I think, is could you give ideas about possible methods to integrate concerns over equity, over accessibility, etc., with course requirements such as online assessment or attendance? And I suppose it's also pointing us towards how do we design in such a way that facilitates greater kind of inclusion and attributes for students.
I think there are media choices that can help, because some types of media are more compatible with the kind of tools that, say, people with disability might have anyway, so screen readers and that kind of thing. So trying to make online materials in a way that can be used by the standard tools that are out there in use is one aspect. If it's core pieces of teaching that, say, perhaps are very very visually based, then there may be a need to think of presenting those or presenting something else as an alternative for some students. So alternative formats, it increases the amount of work, but is often also necessary. Where, for instance, where we use anything that's graphic or visually based, so graphs and charts, or using photographs in teaching and that kind of thing. If it's a core bit of teaching, then we also have to provide a written description of those items to make them accessible to people who might have a visual impairment, for example. So there are those kind of things to deal with, but and I think in terms of online assessments, there would, in any case, I guess, in assessment environments, be a differentiated approach for assessments for students who need it, whether that's providing more time or providing other ways they can complete the assessments. That also needs thinking about.
The question is also asked not just only to disabilities, but also inaccessibility to the internet. So how can we compensate for that? I think it's extremely difficult, and that's where the difficulties of people who might be in a variety of circumstances, might not have good internet access. They might not have the difference between someone who has a room or a spare room they can use for their study and someone who has to kind of do it on the kitchen table with the
the family all around them, increases the burdens immensely on them. There, I think it's something the university, I would have thought that's something that's more a university level concern about how you address that. And there may be, very kind of financially sound reasons for the universities to invest in invest in the provision of alternative formats. If they lose students, they lose thousands of pounds of income. So arguably it's the case that universities, where students are in need of that kind, look to investment in that, to providing students with laptops if that's what's needed. £500, £600, £800 on a laptop compared to £9,000 of fees sounds like a good investment if it's going to keep a student engaged and learning with you. So I think those kind of things are important, but surely the university should have policies and approaches to assisting students anyway, and they need adapting for more online learning pretty urgently, I would have thought.
I would definitely agree with that. And I think what you were saying about kind of diversity of kind of resources for students is something really interesting, because I wouldn't have thought to kind of make different versions of the same information. I would think get a variety of information through a variety of mediums. I wouldn't think to duplicate it, and I think that is kind of really important actually, because everyone learns in different ways. If you've got a core piece, then that again is something we've got to think about, and it's that investment I think we've got to start working towards, not just for now but for the kind of long-term future. I would suggest before we all sign off, William, that you do look at the chat, because 90% of it is people saying thank you for a great presentation and some really helpful insights, and that I will now echo that to yourself. Thank you very much for kind of presenting this. It's incredibly timely, incredibly useful. I will be using and thinking of all of this and kind of stuff I should be doing and thinking about over the next 5 years, not just because of the blended learning pandemic impact. So I think I will echo everyone's sentiments in chat to say thank you very much. With 1 minute to go, thank you everyone for turning up. It's been really lovely hearing from William, but also kind of seeing everyone here today. So look out for our next lot of webinars. Onwards and upwards. Thank you very much. Goodbye.